Hello everyone and welcome to a new video, and in this video I'm going to show you how I went from taking photos like this to now taking photos like this. And I'm also going to show you how I went from using this camera to now using this camera. Now let's get into the video. From a young age, I loved just being out in the bush, and I would occasionally take my father's old Fujifilm camera and take a few shots. But my sister was actually the wildlife photographer in the house. And then I went to the Kruger National Park with my grandparents, where I started taking the photos for the first time with our old Canon PowerShot camera. And even though it wasn't much, I managed to get a few cool photos.
But I would still
consider myself a sightings photographer, because I would just take photos to show and tell people about the amazing sightings we saw on our adventures, which isn't a bad thing if that is what you do, but I wanted to go further into photography. And then I started doing some research and watching way too much YouTube videos. But this really improved my photography because I learned about settings, composition, animal behavior, and much more. And from then, I started loving wildlife photography so much that I asked for a proper camera and lens for my birthday. And it was then when I got the Nikon D3000 with 2 lenses, and the quality of my photos really went up from using that camera. And it was at this stage that I learned 200mm isn't long enough for wildlife. So then, after saving up some money, I got myself my first telephoto lens, the Sigma 150-500. Because my budget was so low, I bought one that couldn't autofocus, and I had it fixed, which ultimately saved me a lot of money. And this lens made all of the difference, because I was able to capture shots of small distant subjects. And because I was so amazed of the impressive 500mm of my new lens, for a while I only took close-up portraits of animals, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but some of your photos might come out a bit bland or boring.
Whereas if you would include a bit more of the environment, your photos might be a bit more pleasing.
And not long after fixing my lens, I upgraded to the Nikon D300S camera. And this pro body, with all its buttons and dials, really made changing the settings much faster and more efficient. And this was actually the first camera where I switched from primarily shooting on auto to now mostly shooting on manual. I know, I shot on auto my entire life up until this point. At this stage, I was still a trigger-happy photographer because I took way too many photos whilst out on safari. I averaged almost 2,000 a day, but through this process, I started to learn what was worth stopping to take a photograph for. But then, whilst selling my Nikon 150 to 500mm lens, someone unfortunately stole it. And this is why I recommend you should double and triple check before selling your prized camera gear. But luckily, even after this unfortunate incident, I was able to upgrade to the Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary lens, which is the predecessor to my old lens. I still use this lens today, and every time I'm blown away by its amazing sharpness and incredible versatility of being able to capture shots anything between 150 and 600 millimeters. And with this camera and lens setup, I got some of my all-time favorite photographs. At this point, I really started to become a better, smarter wildlife photographer. So much so that I even tried out some new artistic techniques, like panning shots for example.
Subscribe to learn more about all these techniques.
And then, back in February of 2025, I bought myself the Nikon D7200. And this is by far the best camera I've ever owned, in everything from ISO performance to image quality. Although I might prefer the frame rate and ergonomics of my previous camera. For those of you who don't know what ergonomics means, ergonomic is the button and dial placement on your camera. Something I would recommend to anyone who is looking for a new camera or lens is to buy it second hand, because you can get great gear for great prices. More recently, I've started editing my photographs, which opened up an entirely new field for me to go and research. And it's quite astonishing to see what editing can do to the final outcome of your images. And then most recently, I've learned about video creating and filmmaking, as well as video editing, all of which I knew nothing before creating this channel. And this is where I find myself now. But photography is a never-ending journey, and there's always something new to learn. So join me as I take you with me on my photography journey. If that sounds cool to you, I would really appreciate it if you just hit the subscribe button and like this video. And then I'll see you in the next one.